There are some historians who remind us that history is not only found in archives and monuments, but also in the memories of ordinary lives. Linda Soaps has been one of the leading voices in this movement for more than 5 decades. A pioneer in the field of oral history, she has worked tirelessly to demonstrate that memory, story, and testimony are not just sources of history, but are themselves acts of meaning making, contested, fragile, and deeply human. Her scholarship is wide ranging and foundational. She co edited the influential volume The Oral History Reader Routledge, which has become an indispensable resource for students and scholars across the world. In Oral History and Public Memories, Temple University Press 2008, she helped shape the conversation on how personal narratives intersect with public history, archives, and collective memory. Her work on Maryland history in the making and her many essays on methodology, ethics, and practice have guided generations of oral historians as they grapple with the complexity of voice, subjectivity, and silence. But Professor Soap's influence extends beyond law. As a former president of the Oral History Association and a leader in shaping national standards for the field, she has played a critical role in establishing oral history as both a discipline and a public practice. Her writings are not only guides for how to conduct interviews, but also meditations on what it means to listen, to remember, and to do justice to lives that might otherwise be forgotten. It is with this remarkable background that she speaks to us today on the long view, the current moment in oral history from the perspective of 50 years in the field. In this lecture, Professor Soap offers not only her reflections on the growth and transformation of oral history, but also her wisdom on its future, what it can teach us about our present moment, and how it continues to challenge the very ways in which history is written and remembered. On behalf of Voices from the Periphery, we are deeply honored to welcome Professor Linda Soaps. Her presence reminds us that to listen carefully is itself a political and ethical act, and that oral history, at once intimate and collective, remains one of the most powerful ways to confront erasure and affirm human dignity. Professor, up to you.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I hope I can live up to it. I'm honored to be speaking with you all today and appreciate your kind invitation to do so. I'm quite impressed with the work of Voices from the Periphery that you're doing to document the lives of the marginalized. As you'll hear, I share many of your values. And I want to thank Pallav Bariega and his colleague Ayush for making the arrangements for today. It is perhaps of interest to you that I'm speaking from my home in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, in the eastern United States, about 300 kilometers west of New York City and 150 kilometers north of the capital, Washington, D.C. It's about 9 o'clock in the morning here. Honestly, it's really quite astonishing to me that we can collapse distance in this medium of Google Meet. Now, Pallav suggested a number of topics about which I might speak: narrative authority in oral history as feminist and ethical practice, archiving, and the unexpected in oral history, which is the title of a recent collection of articles edited by Ricardo Santiago and Miriam Hermato. Also suggested were my editorial work and my work on public memory and community voice. Well, that's quite a list to cover in an hour-long or less than an hour presentation. But underlying, I think, these topics is a larger theme, namely that oral history is in the midst of a paradigm change. As I see it, a shift from a researcher-centered to a narrator or community-centered practice. I understand this shift as a disciplinary response to colonialist critiques, outdated heteronormative assumptions, and calls for social justice in the face of global atrocities and inequalities. It is also a response to the challenges and opportunities of digital technologies, I think. And so, like colleagues in other fields, oral historians are engaging in new ways with the received history of our field, its long-standing assumptions and values, and methodological and interpretive practices. Yet, like all paradigm shifts, this one does not represent a straight line from one way of thinking to another, nor is it entirely supplanting previous approaches to oral history. Much of the work of previous generations of practitioners remains relevant, a ground from which today's oral historians are moving in new directions. And insofar as Talib suggested, I've been observing and participating in the long trajectory of this paradigm shift for really more than half a century. I thought it might be interesting to address this current moment in oral history and some of the more specific topics Talib suggested that embedded within it from the perspective of my own experiences. So I framed my discussion as 3 acts with a prelude, an interlude, and an epilogue. I'm aiming to speak for under an hour, and then I'll open up the program to your questions and comments. Please use the Q&A function in Google Meet for this. If you wish to offer commentary as I speak, please feel free to do so using the chat function. But this is going to be primarily among yourselves because I can't both give a talk and follow a chat simultaneously. I will ask Talib and Ayush to monitor and manage the chat as necessary. I can't do both. So with that, I'll start, but let me ask if you can hear me okay. Do I need to speak more slowly? I understand I tend to speak kind of fast, and I have my own kind of inflections in English. So is there anything I need to do to adjust to your interests or needs?
No, ma'am, it's absolutely fine.
Okay, well, that's good. Okay. Can I ask you how many people am I speaking to? Because I don't see, people or names on a screen.
Actually, the people are watching in YouTube, ma'am, so we really don't know how many. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So,
all right. Well, okay. So to begin with the prelude, my story. I generally date my involvement in oral history to the fall of 1974, when I enrolled in pioneering U.S. oral historian Martha Ross's oral history course during my first semester of graduate school at the University of Maryland. What motivated me to do so? I trace it to 2 strands in my personal history. The first is my family. My 4 grandparents were immigrants to the United States. They came as part of the great mass of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe in the early 20th century to serve as laborers in the nation's expanding industrial economy. Like many immigrants, they experienced poverty, disrespect, and family disruption. My parents, thanks to the burgeoning economy of the post-World War II period, to white skin privilege, and to their own hard work, were able to create a stable and secure middle-class life. I, born just as World War II ended, attended college and married shortly thereafter, marrying up in status, as they say, like a lot of women of my generation, pinning my hopes for continued upward mobility on my husband's status. And I found myself in a social world that was more worldly, more intellectually and socially sophisticated than what I had grown up in. My class identity was shifting, and that made me quite uneasy. Well, that unease led me back to my family history. How did I come to this position in life? How did my history fit into a broader story? This is not something I learned in my formal education. Then, quite by accident, I learned of a classroom project in which students, many from backgrounds similar to mine, about which few histories had been written, about which there were few records to even research such history, were learning about their families by interviewing them using what was then considered the new research method called oral history. Well, a light bulb went off in my head. Oral history, I want to know more about it. I want to learn to use it to learn more about families like mine. Well, that's the first strand of my awakening to oral history. The second is politics, specifically the women's movement. As I was becoming interested in the history of families like mine, I was also becoming active in the women's liberation movement. This was in the late 1960s, early 1970s. I became part of the collective staff of an early feminist publication. One early issue of this publication was centered around the theme of women in history. What? Women had a history? This was news to me, and I wanted to learn more. There wasn't much written about the history of women a half century ago. Again, oral history was becoming a way to record the experiences and views of women and to include them in our collective record of the past. So it was shortly after these epiphanies that I enrolled in Martha Ross's oral history class and quickly became part of a whole cohort of historians, which for some, I became part of a whole cohort of historians, oral and otherwise, engaged in what was known as the new social history, which for some, including me, pivoted around understanding unequal relationships of power. We were both eager to democratize the historical record, and thanks to our political roots, to democratize the audience for history, indeed, to use history as a catalyst for social change. These values have stayed with me, and I think they also correspond to the values of voices from the periphery. So now, Act 1, the Baltimore Neighborhood Heritage Project. Through my connection to Martha Ross, in the late 1970s, I became involved with the Baltimore Neighborhood Heritage Project, developed by a group of historians, social service workers, and community leaders to document, primarily through oral history interviews, the experience of people living in 6 blue-collar neighborhoods in the old industrial city of Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore, I should say, is the largest city in the state of Maryland in the United States. It's located about 200 miles south of New York City and 50 miles north of Washington, D.C., the U.S. capital. I'm sorry, I didn't convert that to kilometers. It's probably about 300 kilometers south of New York City, and maybe about 75 kilometers north of DC. Like many old industrial cities, it was in the death throes of deindustrialization and seeking to reinvent itself in a post-industrial economy characterized by both tourism-oriented service jobs and skilled professional work in healthcare and education. It is also a city that historically has been deeply divided by race, with a history of enslavement, then followed by both legal and customary segregation and discrimination. the significance of which will become obvious shortly in my talk. The people who we hope to interview, who had formed the backbone of the city's industrial past, were not part of the bright new Baltimore envisioned by civic leaders. In fact, many of them were like my family members, immigrants, white immigrants, and their children. And so our project aimed to restore this history via an archival collection to the collective record of our city's past, and in a series of public outcomes to assert the viability of these neighborhoods and the way of life they had sustained over generations against the forces of development and gentrification. We hope, too, that the stories people told would cultivate community identity and pride, and a recognition of its location in a broader historical narrative of industrial development and decline. And congruent with the politics of the new social history, as I had mentioned, we hoped this recognition would support ongoing grassroots activism. Well, the project did enjoy some success, notably a book of neighborhood photographs, a traveling exhibit, and a theater piece crafted from interviews that toured neighborhood venues. What I want to emphasize, though, is the issue of narrative authority. Who has control of the story? The narrators, or we project organizers and interviewers? Well, writing about the project in 1981, shortly after it folded, I said, people told me, this is a quote from 1981, people told me personal stories about hard times during the Depression, about exploitative working conditions, about coping with family difficulties. What meaning or interpretation they did give to their lives was personal, generally a feeling of sturdiness, of pride at having survived difficult circumstances. Try as I would to get feelings of outrage or interpretations of exploitation or some understanding of a life shaped by broader social forces, time and again, I would end up with some variant of times were tough, but we survived. Something similar arose when local residents started conducting oral history interviews themselves, as we had planned. Try as I did to impose order on these interviews by providing an outline of questions, not incidentally imposing my own sense of the historically appropriate categories of inquiry, by the way. Community interviewers ignored my outline altogether and interviewed people about whatever they thought important. Again, to quote from my 1981 article, in addition to the stories of struggle during hard time, which seemed so important to local residents, these interviews contained countless descriptions of what the area looked like years ago, and stories, often very sentimental stories of family life. Very little on local institutions, the social relationships of work, on immigration and assimilation. At one point, I recall saying to my colleagues in frustration, well, did everyone have a saintly mother? That seemed to be everything, what people were saying in their interviews or implying. A comment that has come to haunt me, as we shall see later on in my talk. Well, I hope you can see the tension here. The historian's view, my view, of what's historically important versus local narrators' view of what's important to remember. And although I could recognize the differences in class and culture that underlay these different perceptions of history, you can perhaps hear my frustration at the community view and detect a bit of patronization too. In other words, I was privileging professional authority. I hadn't yet learned the patience or humility to understand what may have underlain these local accounts. So moving along here to Act 2, the Baltimore Neighborhood Heritage Project Revisited. In 2014, I was invited to deliver a keynote at the British Oral History Society's annual meeting, organized that year around the theme of community history, oral history on the ground. Given that theme, I decided to present an assessment of the Baltimore Heritage Project some 3 decades after it had closed up shop. I began my talk by reiterating much of my earlier critique, noting that despite social history's focus on power, conflict, and change, activist sensibilities, the stories we recorded demonstrated a personalization of history, largely stripped of social context. But then, from a distance of 3 decades, I went on to suggest that community projects might have more currency if they focused on contemporary issues of concern rather than individual biographical narratives we had recorded. If they recorded diverse and contradictory points of view about these issues and consciously recognized social differences. And I suggested making the interviews public in the civic arena, for example, by using them as the basis for a series of critical conversations about the issues at hand in the spirit of shared authority at the heart of the oral history enterprise. Not conversations, I would emphasize, that mirror the differential politeness that characterizes too many interviews, but conversations that embrace the hard questions, that respect disagreement, and tolerate discomfort. In other words, I was moving towards a more community-centric approach to oral history, one that engages with the interests and needs of the community as well as the researcher, typically framed today as a collaborative relationship. As I've suggested, this move is connected to current criticisms marginalized communities are leveling against the extractive, exploitative practices of the knowledge industry and its institutions. I think it is also subtly connected to the widespread availability of numerous digital tools, which make it possible, even seem to demand, that we do something with our interviews beyond depositing them in an archive. In other words, to put them to work in the world, to address, per my previous point, the urgency of our times. But a cautionary word here, I want to point out a continuity with previous oral history practice. An interview has long been understood as a mutual enterprise. An ethical practice has long advocated a respectful, mutually beneficial relationship between researcher and narrator community. So while clearly the balance is shifting, or was shifting as I was speaking back in 2014, current approaches do build on existing practice. I've also omitted one element of my 2014 reassessment of the Baltimore Project. In my talk, I admitted that the project, while including a Black neighborhood, Black narrators, and Black interviewers, never really addressed head-on that which continues to divide the city, race. But that's all I said on the project, a woefully ignorant omission about a project documenting a city that was, at that time, and continues to be majority Black. Before picking up this thread and some later thoughts about the Baltimore Project, I want to offer a brief interlude. focusing on how my editorial work has also addressed the question of narrative authority. That is, how to balance, integrate, or otherwise come to terms with both narrator's and author's voice in a published work of oral history. And by way of background, I should just say that from 2001 to 2013, I served as founding co-editor of Palgrave's Studies in Oral History series, during which time we published 37 titles. And since retiring from a 9-to-5 job in 2007, I've done freelance editorial work in humanities fields, including oral history. So over time, I've come to define some principles for oral history, for editing oral history for publication. 3 principles I'll mention. First, keep oral history at the center. This is what distinguishes a publication in oral history from work that draws upon interviews in general, for example, in sociology or journalism. Interviewers, narrators' words ought to dominate the work, but even more, they ought raise the questions posed, drive the argument, and provide much of the evidence. If the typical approach to scholarship is, well, here's my argument, here's the evidence to back it up, with oral history, I say flip it. Here's what the narrator said. Here's what she's getting at, how I make sense of it. Let the narrator's voice and views, their authority, dominate. Now, of course, I'm not saying that authors shouldn't offer their interpretation. Of course they should. This is my second point. Just as an interview is dialogic, an exchange between interviewer and narrator, so too is editing an exchange between editor and narrator. Of course, we should not accept uncritically or accept as true everything a narrator says. Often it's not accurate, but we should assess meaning thoughtfully, taking full measure of the narrator, not simply cherry-pick quotations to support our own argument. Rather, it's using the content and meaning of interviews themselves, the point they are trying to get across even underneath the words, as the focus of the argument, which we, as author or editor, then dialogue with in our own developing text. I am, however, quite impatient with excessive theorization that comments more on an interview than presents the narrative itself. Well, that may be cultural studies, but I don't think it's oral history. My third principle for editing oral history is to represent the narrator's voice as authentically as possible. This means retaining the narrator's words and word order, speech patterns and rhythm, and the way the sense of what the narrator is getting at unfolds. It does not mean paraphrasing, altering what a narrator has said to conform to the rules of grammar, or incorporating explanatory material as if it were the narrator's words, or omitting challenging material, or otherwise distorting the narrator's unique voice. It does mean retaining vernacular speech, both specific words and colloquial word order or sentence structure. It means keeping in the slang, what are called non-standard forms, and not correcting grammar except as it seems to fit the narrator. Let a reader hear how a real person talks. So edited oral history does not read like a standard scholarly text. I do, however, urge caution in trying to approximate pronunciation via phonetic spelling, that is, spelling how a narrator says a word, not the word standard spelling. Phonetic spelling is hard to do well, and it's difficult to read. It's also been used to signal ignorance and demean those whose speech deviates from a culturally defined standard. I'm not saying don't ever use phonetic spelling, but if you do so mindfully and judiciously. I hope these three principles recognize both narrative and editorial authority in editing oral history for publication, which I think of as similar to the act of translation. There is the source text to which we must remain faithful, but also its conversion into something made meaningful, that is to say, accessible to the reader. So now, onto the final act, Act 3, Beyond the Baltimore Neighborhood Heritage Project. You'll recall that I ended the discussion of my 2014 reassessment of the project by admitting that it never really addressed head-on that which continues to divide the city. This was a pro forma acknowledgement of a problem, not a serious effort to explain why that was so or how we could have done better. So when during the Q&A, the question and answer period following that talk, a Black woman pressed me a bit on the matter, I fumbled, knowing even as then that my response was inadequate. And that left me with a very lingering unease. So when a few years later, a posting on the Facebook page of Columbia University's Oral History MA program noted that students had been discussing, quote, the whiteness of the field of oral history, it touched a nerve. Undoubtedly, several well-publicized incidents of deadly force wreaked upon innocent Black men and women during these years, along with the Black Lives Matter movement decrying this violence, was gradually shifting what I and many other white people thought we knew about race and racial injustice in the United States. We were coming to understand more deeply, if still even quite imperfectly, how limited, how structural racism penetrated every aspect of life in the United States. And so I asked myself, what might I, as a white woman with decades of experience in institutionalized oral history, do to advance an awareness of oral history's implication in a culture of racialized whiteness? This led me to develop a session for the 2020 U.S. Oral History Association meeting scheduled for Baltimore that posed the question, is oral history white? In that session, 3 panelists considered way race had been instantiated in 3 legacy oral history collections in Baltimore, including the Neighborhood Heritage Project, as well as a project focused on local civil rights activism and a project documenting people's experiences during the riots in the city that followed the assassination of civil rights leader Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968. Each presenter assessed project conceptualization and execution and the institutional context in which it had been done. Each demonstrated how unexamined racialized assumptions, institutional self-interest, and interviewer unease, among other factors, including in my own interviews, a racialized ignorance, shaped a project in ways that only can be called racist. Well, the enthusiasm with which the session was received led those of us involved in it to organize a symposium the following summer that invited others to explore broader questions of race and power in oral history. It was during that symposium that the paradigm change I have been describing and that had been happening all around me came into focus by placing narrators and communities at the center of our work, rather than our own research agendas, perhaps. We are recognizing and seeking to change the racialized structures of power that have penetrated so many aspects of our work. Indeed, that racialized structure inflects the very question, is oral history white? Of course it's not, and yet we have assumed that it is. Now let me end with a brief epilogue. Through various twists and turns in my involvement with local Baltimore history, I have, within the past year, become involved with the Public History Project to document, especially through oral history, a local community established in the 19th century by slaves emancipated from a nearby plantation, some of whose descendants still live in this community. It has remained a Black enclave in a white-dominant area and has, as such, been subjected to both public neglect and eroded by development pressures. Yet it also retains its unique identity. It has been a haven for its residents over generations and works hard to protect what remains. The current public history project I'm involved in is an effort to make its history better known in hopes of garnering greater public support for the long-term preservation of this community. Well, I had planted the seed of an oral history project some 5 years ago, made some local connections by showing up at community events and meetings. And, that's sort of the first rule of community work, show up. But it has taken this long for an oral history project to gain traction. This time, however, unlike the Baltimore Neighborhood Heritage Project, it is the community that is driving the project, not well-meaning historians. The community is determining the nature and scope of the interviews. It's identifying narrators. It's determining what story it wants to tell. I'm reminded here of a phrase in the U.S. Oral History Association's Guideline for Social Justice Oral History Work, that meaningful oral history moves at the speed of trust. That's the quote. It moves at the speed of trust. And that speed is often quite slow. We'll remember my frustrated comment about the stories of heroic mothers in the Neighborhood Heritage Project. Remember I said, did everyone have a saintly mother? Well, perhaps those tales of heroic mothers weren't really all that wrong when you consider the depths of hardships endured, labors unrewarded, sorrows borne, especially in communities of color, but in all marginalized communities. I think I've finally been able to catch a glimmer of both the lamentation and pride at the core of these community narratives, which in their own way speak of a steadfast resistance that I'd been looking for all along. So let me end here with the words of Walter Carr, a Black man interviewed by the Baltimore Project back in the 1970s. At the end of the interviewer asked, "Is there anything else you'd like to say about the whole community history project?" Well, here's how Mr. Carr responded. "Well, it might sound one-sided." This is a quote. "Well, it might sound one-sided because I've only heard your side. But I didn't have to hear your side once I learned that a white man was head of this project. Because there is no way in the world that he could present this history in the light that it is supposed to be presented. Unless you bring him down here to live with me for a week and go with me for a week, then I might qualify him for heading this project because he doesn't know what it's all about. That's how I feel about it. Ain't no way he could sit up there in that ivory tower and tell me what's going on down here, or even make you or anybody else who's going to understand these people realize what it's all about. Well, Mr. Carr may have been way ahead of us oral historians. It's taken me 50 plus years to even catch a glimpse of this. So I will end here and thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy now to entertain your comments and questions. Where is the Q&A? More options. I don't see questions. So maybe we just take them from all of you. I'm not sure what to do here. Halib, what do we do? Or Aish?
Yeah, ma'am. Hello. Am I audible?
Now I see only I see only like 6 people here.
Am I audible?
I see the chat. Maybe we should use the chat, or what do you want to do here?
Okay. Hello, ma'am. Am I audible? Ma'am?
Are you saying something to me?
Yeah, ma'am. Am I audible?
What?
Am I audible, ma'am?
Are you what?
Am I audible, ma'am? Okay.
Why don't you put what you're saying in the chat? There's a couple of words I can't catch. Oh yes, you're quite audible. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I couldn't catch that word, audible.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Soaps, for that truly inspiring lecture. Your reflections on the long view, the current movement in oral history from the perspective of 50 years in the field, have given us not only a sweeping view of how the discipline has evolved, but also a profound meditation on what it means to listen, to remember, and to bear witness. You have reminded us that oral history is never just about collecting stories. It is about confronting silences, questioning the conditions under which memories are spoken or withheld, and acknowledging the power relations that shape whose voices are preserved and whose are lost. In tracing the trajectory of oral history across 5 decades, you have shown us both its struggles and its triumphs, how it has moved from the margins to the center of historical practice, how it has challenged conventional archives, and how it continues to raise pressing ethical questions about representation, subjectivity, and authority. What emerged from your lecture is the recognition that oral history is not merely a method, but a politics, and insistence that history just include the voices of those who have too often been silenced or excluded. For all of us gathered here, your lecture has been much more than a retrospective. It has been an invitation to carry oral history forward with renewed critical awareness. It challenges us to think about how, in this present moment of contested truths and fragile memories, the act of listening itself becomes an act of justice. With these reflections in mind, let us now open the floor for questions and dialogues so that we may continue this conversation with you, Professor Soaps, and draw further from the wisdom of your experience and scholarship.
Halib, if I do it one half of what you said, I will be very grateful. Thank you.
I'm sorry, ma'am, if I have any mistake or
No, it's just
pardon
very
me.
very laudatory. Let's see. I do see a question from Karen Donahue.
Yeah, ma'am.
Mystery says,
I'm
you
I'm
ever
reading this
doubted Brett? How do you deal with this? For instance, yes, I not only have to answer Karen Donahue's question in the chat. I can do that. I have many times not just doubted, but demonstrated the lack of veracity of an account. Some falsehoods, shall we say, they're just the normal kinds of mistakes that people make. You know, we missay a name, or we remember a date wrong. They're quite casual, in some ways not terribly insignificant errors in memory. You know, they're not terribly significant. Sometimes I will, in publishing it, just correct it. I'll point that out to the narrator if they're available, and say, you made a mistake on the date, and you know, they're usually quite accommodating and say, oh yes, you're right, it was 1948, not 1943, or something like that, and I just correct it. Other times I will correct it, or I won't correct it, but I'll make a footnote and say that and explain the error. And let me give you an example. In an interview I edited, a man described a neighborhood park that he lived in, and it was talking about the 1940s, 1950s, when legal segregation was, racial segregation was in force in Baltimore, in all kinds of complicated and difficult ways. And he said the park, and he was a white man, he said the park was strictly white use. Well, in fact, it wasn't. The park had a very complicated code of racial segregation, more by custom than by fact. There were two ball fields, one of which was used by white people, one of which was used by black people. Tennis courts could be used by both blacks or whites, but they couldn't play together in the same game. And it went on with, you know, sort of ridiculous efforts to both manage and ignore segregation. There was a swimming pool that was only available to white people. So what I said in a footnote basically is that in fact, the park was not strictly white used, as he said, and I described some of the complexities, but in his view, it was, because he was always in that part of the park, and it's a big park, that white people used. So I explained the error. I can give another example from a book I edited. A woman, the author was editing interviews with a woman named Julia, who was a labor activist in the early 20th century. And Julia had misrepresented her racial identity. She said she was half black, or a 1/4 black, because her grandfather had married his former slave. Well, that didn't sit right with me. First of all, that would have been very unusual. Secondly, Julia's brother had contradicted this story. Third, and this is what really alerted me, the marriage had presumably taken place in Kentucky, the state of Kentucky, which at the time had miscegenation laws, that is, laws that prevented Black and white people from marrying. There was no documentary evidence in the census, in the marriage certificate, in any other available public document that this grandmother was Black. Now, there is an outside chance that she was. There is an outside chance that they were able to overcome this racial barrier to marry. But it is highly, highly unlikely. So I brought this to the attention of the author. Unfortunately, she could not go back to Julia because Julia had died and ask her for more complete explanation of this. But what she decided that this was one of the stories that Julia had made up. And she did it for a couple of reasons. It was kind of to shock people, so that when they would come out with racially disparaging remarks, she could say, well, wait a minute, I'm part Black, and kind of catch them by surprise. It was also her way of asserting solidarity with Black labor activists by referring, Black activists, as you may know, or labor activists, refer to each other as my brother and my sister. You know, it's kind of a way of indicating solidarity. And she would be able to claim partially Black identity by when she would speak about my sister so-and-so in the labor movement. So the author explained this in the introduction to her book, that Julia there's no evidence to support this assertion of a Black grandmother, but here's why she may have stated that. She left it intact in the actual narrative. So I know I'm not speaking very coherently, perhaps, but does that answer your question, Karen, or do you want to pose a second question?
Ma'am, the questions are from our YouTube platform. So with your kind permission, may I proceed?
Sure.
Okay, ma'am. I am typing this on our chat box, ma'am, and I am also reading this. Okay. Just 1 minute.
Okay, I see it. If oral history is itself shaped by who chooses to speak and who remains silent, how can the method ever claim to recover the voices of the truly marginalized, rather than merely those willing or permitted to narrate within existing structures of power? Well, partly I want to say you have to accept that limit. We can only interview those who are willing to be interviewed. And we can't interview those who have died, and who often have died precisely because they do exist in marginalized circumstances, because they don't have access to good health care, for example. So we have to accept that that is the limit. The only thing I can say is sometimes it just takes time. It takes time and patience. And I'm not talking about a week or even a month. I'm talking about years, that you cultivate a relationship with the community. And some of those who are unwilling to speak will over time as they see, others being interviewed, that it can be a good process, will come forward. But not always. I have been working, and I didn't talk about this, but I have been working with a group in the state of Maryland that is trying to bring public attention to the 38 known racial terror lynchings done in the state of Maryland in the 19th and early 20th centuries. 38 men were lynched, we know of. There probably were more. And it's all part of a broader effort at racial justice, racial reconciliation, racial restitution. And in fact, not many, maybe it's wrong to say many, several people who have been identified as descendants of people who have been lynched, because some very good genealogical work has been done, don't want to talk about it. It's too painful. They do not want to talk about it. Well, that's their right. People have a right to not talk about that which they don't want to talk about. And I think we just have to accept that. I was working with a woman on another project, an African-American woman whose family has some memory of a lynching, and she just does not want to talk about it. It's too painful. She said, I remember my mother telling me about this, and it brings up memories of my mother and how hard this was for her, and I don't want to talk about it. Now, over time, maybe will she? I don't know. So, I'm sorry. Let me look at your question again and see if there's another way to answer it. But that's my assessment. Sometimes too, and I've seen this with students of mine, that the narrator won't allow them to record. They don't want it to be on the record, but they'll talk to them. And that knowledge that's communicated can be used as background, if you will. You can't not unlearn what you've learned in a conversation with someone. And so that becomes part of your reservoir of knowledge. You can't quote from them, you can't put them in a book, but you have learned something simply by talking with them. Yeah. I mean, that's the best way I can answer your question. You can't interview people who don't want to be interviewed. That's what a police state does, right? And you certainly don't want to be that.
Okay, ma'am. So we are proceeding to our next question. This is from Rakhi. Okay. I typed this question. Given the fragility, selectivity, and subjectivity of memory, how do we prevent oral history from becoming less a discipline of history and more a discipline of nostalgia, or worse, a romanticization of experience that obscures structural critique?
Yeah, well, that's the question, isn't it? That's the question. And I think we do it in several ways. We do it by the questions that we ask. And I'll give an example of that in a minute. We do it by listening deeply, as I tried to do, at the, shall we say, the subtext, the meaning underneath the words. People often use quite almost cliched language, because they don't have a wide vocabulary to express their thoughts. And I think by repeatedly asking the same question in different ways, you get at different ways into their views. And I think sometimes that you find that structural critique that you want embedded in what they're saying. Listen carefully underneath the words. And finally, I would say, again, respectfully, offer, point it out. Point it out, the romanticization and the erasure of structural critique. I mean, I certainly get that all the time. Now, let me give you, and you can read between the lines too. Let me give you the example I had. I had occasion for some freelance work I was doing to interview a elderly woman who was really a white woman, who was really part of the social elite of Baltimore at a given time. She was on the board of directors of a historic house museum, and it was a historic house that had been in the family of a very prominent and one of the movers and shaker families, of Baltimore. And in their own way, quite exploitative in labor relations, in financial dealings, and so on and so forth. So she was part of this social elite, and she loved her position. Well, my job was to interview her about her work on the board of this house. So, and I have to say, I like the woman. We often find ourselves in the position of, liking these people we interview, even though we deplore their politics, because you kind of just see a person. So, and she was really quite a interesting and well-spoken, thoughtful woman. So I said at the end, towards the end of the interview, I'm going to ask you a question that may be a little challenging or difficult for you to answer. But I want to ask you what you think is the and I use different language, but what's the relevance of this historic house that's really a monument to wealth and privilege in a city, that's largely poor and black. She couldn't answer it. She fumbled. She said a few things. Maybe we should have school children come into this building, bring school children. Well, I can just see these 5th grade African-American children in this very fancy house with beautiful, fragile objects. It's ridiculous to even to think about bringing them in there. It would have no meaning to them at all, as far as I can tell. She fumbled, and that was telling. And anyone who uses this interview, if they can read even halfway between the lines, can appreciate how ignorant she is of the realities of social life in Baltimore these days. So again, it's perhaps not the perfect answer to the question, but the best I can do. So now I have a question.
Shautan, you can unmute yourself. Hello, Shautan sir.
Yes.
Yeah, you can ask the question to me directly.
Yes, ma'am. I am Sautun Rudro. I respected my madam. I am from Bardwan. I have a question. How related the influence, the environmental history of oral history and environmental history, how relate?
I'm not sure I caught the second half of the question, but I do see the question in the chat, and I heard you say how oral history is related to environmental history. Was there something I'm missing in the question?
Yes, ma'am, that's the question. Yeah, ma'am.
Okay. I don't have great knowledge of oral histories in use in oral history, in environmental history. I do know that it is often used, or it is increasingly used by geographers and others in similar fields to document previous land use practices, how it is used to learn from older people what have been historic land use ways the land has been used and understood. I know this is happening in national parks in the United States and in Canada, perhaps in India also and elsewhere in the world, that are working with First Nations or Native American communities to understand the different ways mainstream white culture and local native culture have understood and made sense of the land. It's certainly well known now that native cultures have really understood the land as a kind of living organism that they must work in harmony with, as opposed to often white imperialist culture that uses the land up for its own profit, really, its own benefit. And these parks are beginning to listen to native approaches, not just to land management, but to their interpretation in the parks. So that's a particular way. There's a lot of work that's done, or a good amount of work that's done, following environmental disasters, like floods and fires, that document. We call them natural disasters. They're really man-made disasters because of land use policies often. I have heard, and I don't have firsthand knowledge of this, but I have heard that there is sometimes critique of, sort of oral historians coming into communities that have really been devastated by floods or fire. And, in a way, sort of barging in and asking people for their experiences during this tragedy, rather than more carefully connecting to the community in a more sustained sort of way. Yes, the Stephen Sloan and Mark Cave book. I thank you for noting that, Karen. I was going to pull it off on my shelf and mention it. It does, in fact. I was using it to my comments. So thank you for that reference.
Thank you so much.
That's the best answer I can give you.
Madam, my research area, environmental history, hilly area, environmental history, hilly area, my research. So I am some people's oral history related question, environmental history related question.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
My research, madam, environmental history, hilly area, hilly area. And that's why
in India, environmental history in India.
India. Hilly area, some people's oral history, my research oriented program. That's like this question is good, and some books name this research oral history environmental related books.
Halib, could you put that in a chat comment? I'm having a hard time just sort of catching.
Okay. Maybe he is asking for some books. I mean, some recommendation of books based on oral history and the environment history of the relation between oral history or environment history, I think.
Okay. There is the one that Karen mentioned, a book by Stephen Sloan and Mark Cave. Let me see if I quickly can get the title of it. Cave. Oh, here it is. Listening on the Edge, Stephen Sloan and Mark Cave. There's another one that I am familiar with. Oh, Kathy. Oh, I'm going to have to, it's not, I'm not remembering the title. I'm not remembering the title or the author. It's slipping my mind, but I can see it. I'm going to have to research that, and I'll email Khalib, and he can pass that information on to you. I'm sorry, I can't recall the author. Maybe it'll come to me in a few minutes, but it slipped my mind, but I know the book. And if anybody else has suggestions, please put them in the chat. It's a good question.
Okay, so the next question is from Arnab, ma'am. I put this in the chat box. The question is, does the very act of turning oral testimony into a usable historical source risk re-inscribing hierarchies where the historian still decides what is credible, valuable, and publishable, thus replicating the same exclusions oral history claims to resist? Ma'am.
Well, in its most extreme, I would say yes. And then why do it? There's something self-defeating, I think, in this either or way of looking at it. And we can't escape the power relations in which we exist. We can't escape them. All we can do, it seems to me, is push against the boundaries. And I think by conscientiously spending time, listening carefully, being extremely self-critical, we can push perhaps the power boundaries. We're not going to erase them. I don't think oral history is the same as revolution. I think it's, a very small step at changing popular understanding. It is not, if structural change is really your driving passion, then, I would say become politically active. And oral history can be a handmaiden of that. It can support it. It can help shift the narrative. It can bring new views, new voices into public consciousness. But it in and of itself is not, it can support transformation of power. It can, in its own small way, demonstrate a move in the direction of shifting hierarchies. But I think we have to have a fairly humble view of what we can and cannot do. And I think it is that humility, in a way, that allows us to hear more deeply what people are saying, and and represent it in a way that doesn't simply risk re-inscribing hierarchies, as you say, and replicate exclusions oral history claims to resist. I can tell you that this work with the Lynching Memorial Project is both raising awareness slowly and gradually over time over the depth of this violence, many people, black and white, have been unaware how close lynchings are to local history. And to learn that is sobering. It is also bringing up huge resistance. People don't want to talk about it. People don't want to hear about it. Aren't you just bringing up old wounds? Aren't you just making things worse? So, that's a risk. I can't affirm, you just do the best you can, and, you don't know what the consequences are going to be. So I wish I could be more affirmative here, but I can't.
Okay, so next question is from Shonok. He's asking, is it ever truly ethical to transform deeply personal narratives into scholarly work, given that the subjects often can't control how their voices are framed, interpreted, or circulated in academic and public domains?
Yeah, again, I can't give you a black and white, yes, no, either or answer. The ideal is to work collaboratively with the speakers of these personal narratives and get their permission. I mean, we should not be publishing work that people don't give our permission to do. We should not be framing them, interpreting, or circulating them without their permission and in ways that they agree to. They should be full partners in the work. I understand that is not always possible, but that should be the goal to which we aspire. Is it truly ethical? You have to decide that. Where's your boundary? These we are not going to change the structures of marginalization and academic work completely by doing oral history. I will say this, and I know I can assume that many of you are actively either involved in or aspire to an academic career. I think that's hard. I have never had a full-time tenured academic position. Some of that's by circumstance, a lot of it is by choice. I did not want to be confined by the institutional imperatives. I have many colleagues whom I respect deeply who do, and who push very valiantly against the boundaries. There is this narrative now of community engagement, and some of that is sincere, some of it is quite insincere and rather crassly political. So that, I believe that, I don't want to say I believe, I challenge oral historians to think not how can these interviews advance or support my academic work, but to start from the other place. How can the oral history work I want to do connect with the interests and needs of the community, not how they can support my academic work? If your priority is academic work, you're going to be pushing against this all the time. You're going to be pushing against it all the time. And all I can say is do the best you can. Is it ever truly ethical? Probably not. But is it moving towards a greater ethic and responsibility? Yes, I think so.
Okay, next question is from Shayantan. He is asking, can oral history
Same question, really.
escape complicity with state and institutional power when so many oral history projects are funded, archives, and curated by the very institutions that also police whose voice matter and whose don't.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It depends on, what degree of surveillance they're going to place on your work. Is there a measure of complicity? Perhaps. I'll tell you, the neighborhood project the project that I ended talking about with a small African American community that is descendants from enslaved people. We had a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities in the United States, which funds research in the humanities or public projects in the humanities. Well, you probably have some sense of the dreadful situation we are experiencing here in the United States with our current president and his efforts to control the narrative in a way that of United States history that is purely celebratory. And in fact, the grant we received from the NEH was rescinded by the National Endowment for the Humanities because it is not in line with the president's celebratory agenda for U.S. history. Well, we're proceeding without it. We're proceeding without it. We have reconfigured what we're doing. We have another small grant from a state agency that has not rescinded the grant. We're all taking a cut in pay, and we're doing it. We're just doing it, and we'll see what happens. But at least in the United States, and I can't speak to the situation in India really at all, the United States is so vast that a lot of people are going on with their work that really challenges existing structures of power, that are advancing narratives that are not celebratory. There's so many of them that it's hard to control all of them. Yeah, you run the risk. We do run the risk. We run the risk. But, we've done the work that we've done so far. That will remain unless things get really bad and they start rounding people up and demanding our interviews and erasing them from the record. I find that hard to believe, but that may speak to the privilege I have of living in a country where that has never really happened in my experience. So, the questions are real. The questions are very real.
Next question is from Maria. She is asking, how can oral history reconcile the epistemological tension between memory as lived, embodied experience and history as a discipline that seeks critical distance without collapsing one into the other or privileging one form of truth over another?
Reconcile the epistemological tension between memory as lived, embodied experience and history as a discipline that seeks critical distance without collapsing one unto the other or privileging one form of truth over another. Well, memory as lived embodied experience is also a form of truth. It is not objective truth. It is not positive. It is not truth in the positivist tradition. But what people believe to be true has enormous implications. Again, to refer to my lynching, the lynching memorial project, I have had people say to me, there were no lynchings in Maryland. Well, that's just patently false. There were, and there's good, solid documentation. By pointing out the distinction between what people remember and what is in fact objective, is so far as anything is really objective truth, points out how memory tells us what we want to remember. Now, are you? Yeah, right. I understand that. That's Karen's point is a very good one, and that the objective truth is. I can't tell you how many times I've looked at the documentary record, and it's false. It's inaccurate. It's not correct. Errors get replicated in document after document after document. Again, I can give examples, but it's perhaps not. That's not necessary. Are you all familiar, or any of you familiar with the work of Alessandro Portelli? I believe he spoke to you. You know, he addresses better than anybody I know the inherent subjectivity of oral history and the need to embrace that subjectivity as speaking to, what does he call it, dreams, desires, and something, and to point that out in a very critical work. His work on the massacre in Rome is very sharp at pointing out the disjuncture between popular memory and what by all accounts is a more accurate version of the past. He also writes about the ambiguity of that, and why people hold the memories that they do, despite evidence to the contrary. So, again, it's the question that there's no easy answer to an either or. No either or answer. My whole temperament is critical. I can always find the hole in an argument. I can always see what's wrong, and more than one person has said to me, "Oh, Linda, why are you so critical?" Well, a critical sensibility is valued in the academic world. It is often not valued elsewhere. And so, I felt comfortable in the critical world of the academy. But I have learned through oral history to try to get underneath that, to not be so quick to jump in with a critical comment, and to really try to listen to what people are getting at. We who are well educated have a well developed critical vocabulary. People who do not have that privilege often do not have that critical vocabulary. But if you listen to them long enough, they get to it. They're not without their own degree of criticism. Even the most, sort of self-effacing and humble person can understand from their own experience a critical perspective if we give them the room and the space to do so. Some are very quick to do it. I found often that marginalized individuals, that labor activists are very quick in their criticism. They get it. They're very quick. Others do not. They've not had the opportunity to exercise that kind of intelligence.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much. The next question is from Jessica. She is asking, if every act of remembering is also an act of forgetting, and every narrative is structured by silence as much as speech, what methodological strategies can oral historians employ to account for the constitutive absence at the heart of testimony? Okay, I just put it on the chat box also, ma'am. If you,
I see it, yes. I appreciate that you're doing that. That's great. Yeah. Well, I wouldn't always say that it's an act of forgetting, but it is an act of omission. I often say that, in an interview compresses 60, 70, 80 years of living into 2, 3, 10, 20 hours of narrative. Living experience and a narrative about that experience are really two different things. And, again, this is both the limit and the value of our field. We get to hear how people use language to make sense of their experience. There will always be silences. There will always be absences. And a methodological intervention that we can employ is to not limit ourselves to a 1 or a 2 hour interview, to go back repeatedly and get depth. I mean, there's an anecdote that I keep remembering from interviews done by a historian who was interviewing people's strategies for coping with deindustrialization in a coal mining community, the death of the coal industry in Pennsylvania, where I live. And through informal conversation, as he was reviewing with the narrator the text he wanted to publish, came up that the narrator, like many men in his community, was an avid sportsman. He enjoyed hunting and fishing. And that had never come up in the interview. And so when the interviewer, talking informally with this narrator, said, "Oh, Tom, I never knew that you were, so interested in hunting and fishing." And the narrator said, "Well, you never asked." Well, you got to ask, you got to ask. You need to have the patience to listen, to interview, and to listen over time. There will be omissions. There will be omissions. There will be omissions because you never asked. There will be omissions because the person chooses not to tell you. There will be omissions because they wish to withhold, because they don't trust you, because it's too personal. There will be omissions. And that is simply, I think, to be both, they're worked against in the work we do and acknowledged.
Next question is from Piali. Given that the very act of... Hello, ma'am?
I was just going to say, it's the nature of what we do. It's the nature of what we do. But I'm sorry, I see the next question, so go ahead.
Okay, ma'am. So next question from Piali. Given that the very act of interviewing is dialogic and co-constructed, to what extent can oral historians claim authorship or authority over the narratives produced? And does this destabilize the very notion of historical evidence?
We can't claim sole authority or authorship. I think we need to claim co-authorship, co-authority. And we need to be honest about the extent to which we have interfered with, shall we say, which we have shaped narratives. I think we need to be absolutely clear about that. And does this destabilize the very notion of historical evidence? Of course it does. And so what? That it does. If you're working within a paradigm of positivism and objectivity, oral history is not going to work. You can get certain information. You can get certain information from an interview that you can't get from other sources. But really, are we after information, or are we after more ways people make sense of and interpret their experience? I mean, I really think of oral history as sitting at the crossroads between oral history and literature. Literature is much more a humanities discipline of, how people make sense of their experience, how they put it into words. And I think that oral history might properly be thought of as sitting at the line, at the margins of both history and literature. I really do. I think of it as a sort of quintessential humanities discipline, not comfortably fitting in with traditional paradigm of history. I will say in the United States, it's getting increasingly accepted as a form of evidence. But if you're looking for objective, quote unquote, truth, you're not going to find it in an oral history interview. Again, you'll get certain facts that are verifiable and worth having. But that is not what it is. That is not what it is.
The last question is from Ayush, my friend. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, Ayush. When oral history challenges the archive by producing counter archives of memory, does it risk creating yet another archive subject to its own exclusions and regimes of power? And how might one methodologically guard against reproducing precisely what one seeks to critique? This is the last question.
Right. When it challenges the archive by producing counter archives, does it risk creating yet another archive subject to its own? Yes, of course it does. It does risk creating its own exclusions and regimes of power. And yet I don't think that invalidates the work it has done or does do to challenge existing regimes of power. How might one methodologically guard against reproducing precisely what one seeks to critique? Always asking that question, always asking, who am I omitting? When you design an oral history project, one of the key questions, I think, as you begin to identify narrators is to say to yourself, well, now, who am I omitting? Who am I forgetting to think about? Who am I, often, simply enough, it's projects, they omit interviewing women. They interview men in a certain situation, not women. That's a question that needs to be asked. So you have to be rigorously self-critical. And you also have to understand that these limits exist. Just as one generation challenges the previous, another generation is going to challenge you. They will see things that you do not see. I began by saying my impetus for becoming engaged in oral history was to democratize the historical record. A question that's only lately come to mind is why did it need to be democratized in the first place? What were the structures of power that limited the sort of archival evidence that has been available? And that has to do with archives being institutions of the state or of privileged or of people of privilege, and the church. That has traditionally been, how archives has been developed. I'm very heartened by what are now being understood as community-driven archives. But of course, communities have their own, boundaries of exclusion. A lot of communities want what I call hit parade history. They want to interview the people who are prominent in the communities, the community spokesman. Well, our job is to get underneath that too. You have to respect the gatekeepers of community and their views, but you can also, over time, as trust develops, perhaps say, well, maybe we should be interviewing so and so. Maybe we should be interviewing so and so. So again, my answer is you have to respect the limits. You have to understand, with some humility, the limits of our position, and you have to be rigorously self-critical and push against them.
Okay. So, before we take leave of this gathering, I feel a deep responsibility, one born of gratitude, to say a few words to you, Professor Stokes. Listening to you this evening has been like walking through a garden of memory, where each reflection you shared opened not only onto the story of oral history, but also onto the meaning of listening itself. In your words, we heard the quiet beauty of 50 years spent in conversation with voices and the world might have forgotten. You did not merely chart a field, you showed us how the act of listening be an act of love, of care, of justice. Your lecture reminded us that stories are fragile things. They can be silenced, distorted, erased. Yet you have shown us that with patience, humility, and courage, stories can also be carried forward, given dignity, given space to live again. For us, your reflections felt less like history at a distance and more like an intimate call, arguing us to listen better, to hold silence with respect, to honor the words entrusted to us. We are humbled by the generosity with which you shared your wisdom, not as pronouncements from above, but as gifts offered with the gentleness of someone who has spent a lifetime listening first and speaking only after. It is rare to encounter scholarship that carries such humanity within it. Professor Stokes, your presence has been a blessing for us. We will leave this gathering not only with knowledge but with a different rhythm in our hearts, the rhythm of listening, and that is perhaps the greatest gift you could have given us. With folded hands and deepest reverence, we thank you, Professor Linda Stokes.
Well, those are very kind words, and I appreciate it. I think I'm reflecting on all the questions that you've asked. I mean, they're going to bounce around in my head for a long time. I hope what I have suggested by tracing my own trajectory is something of the limits of our own work, and understanding the limits and understanding them over time. I mean, I was a pretty gung-ho and naive scholar back in the 1970s. And I think I expected more of oral history than I was getting. But as I, sort of listened and kept doing it and kept rethinking my work, I come to a deeper knowledge of the value of what people say, even if it doesn't conform to my own categories. So in a way, I think I hope this doesn't sound too self-satisfied. I think in a way, my work over a half century has been a kind of lesson in humility for me. So take that for what it's worth. Take that for what it's worth. Keep doing the work and keep thinking about it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
Yeah. Bye bye.